as it fitfully blows, half conceals, half discloses.
Now it catches the gleam of the morning's first beam.
In full glory reflected, now shines on the stream. 'Tis the star-spangled banner, oh, long may it wave, o'er the land of the free and the shalt thou rise. For dreadful from each torrent's throat, for dreadful, dreadful from each torrent's throat. As fell a blast, the blast that tears the skies, serves not to root thy native home. With freedom found, shall to thy happy coast repair, shall to thy happy, happy coast repair. Blessed Isle with matchless beauty crowned, and